the union budget is to give an account of expenditure for the country over the next year. But in India, the whole process and the day of the budget, the speech, is much more than just an accounting exercise. It's also, in a sense, an opportunity for political messaging, for the government of the day to talk about their achievements and set up a vision for what they plan to do next. One way or the other, mitigating the bite of inflation will be crucial this time round. Inflation is right now a worldwide problem, but in India it pinches even more. When the prices of cooking oil or pulses or milk go up, it results in families going without a meal in large parts of our country. For the consuming middle class, it means cutting out on a visit to the restaurant or the movie or the mall or buying less clothes, everything which impacts the economy. Now, how to ensure inflation won't dampen consumer sentiments will be a key challenge. We're talking about this on the show today, but let's begin with giving you a sense of what a big problem inflation has become, especially in the last 1 year.
Have you ever calculated how much you end up spending every day as soon as you step out of home? Have you been noticing how your monthly budget is completely wrecked with rising costs? Have you found yourself eating into your savings to merely meet your regular expenses? Well, if your answer is yes to all of the above, then you are suffering from what is now called inflation poverty. Rise in petrol, diesel prices leading to increased transport cost, costlier cooking gas as well as cooking ingredients such as oil, wheat, dairy, fruits and vegetables is leading to even food getting costlier. Then of course some leisure activities, going for a movie, dinner, taking a flight, traveling. Oh, the pocket pinch is severe.
Well, new year but old story. If one word was to define 2022 for the middle class Indians, it will be the M word, mehengai. Well, rising prices for this often termed as aspirational class is the biggest pain point and hence is the cornerstone of Budget 2023 expectations. But just to put things into perspective, let's do some number crunching for you to see the rise in prices from Budget 2022 to Budget 2023.
Well, statistically speaking, the key consumer inflation number has come down from the peak of over 7% to 5.72% in December, but this consumer price inflation number does not reflect all that the average middle class Indian spends on. Expenses like entertainment, dining out, transportation do not get fully factored in. Now, when you look at individual items, it is clear that we are spending much more than a year ago. For example, Mother Dairy toned milk cost rupees 49 per litre in March of 2022 but rose to rupees 53 per litre in December 2022. LPG cooking gas, well, a 14.2 kg Indian gas cylinder was for rupees 949 and 50 paise in the national capital in March of 2022, but increased to rupees 1003 by the end of the year. In January of 2022, petrol was at rupees 95.45 per litre in Delhi, which currently stands at rupees 96.76. Now, airfares. Well, ATF or aviation turbine fuel saw 8 price hikes only in 2022. So much so that overall throughout 2022, ATF prices went up by 55%, thereby impacting airfare. Now, a flight from New Delhi to Mumbai, which was for rupees 5,675 in January 2022, shot up to rupees 9,640 in December of 2022, well, a whopping 70% rise. Not just that, in the international circuit, a Mumbai to New York sector saw a total hike of 152.6%. On to another key part of household budgets, pulses. Well, tur dal saw a 12.87% hike last year in Kolkata, an even higher 16.5% hike in Delhi, 21.3% rise in Mumbai, and a whopping 25.74% increase in Chennai, all just over the last 1 year. Now let's remember These are only a few metrics to jog your memory and take note of consistent hikes across your everyday products. Now the question is, will Budget 2023 give relief to the Indian middle class? Raksha Behani for Mirror Now.
And joining me now are Subhash Chandra Garg, former Finance Secretary of India. I'm speaking today with Madan Sabnavis, Chief Economist at the Bank of Baroda. Rajni Sinha, Chief Economist at Care Edge Ratings, is with us. And Yuvika Singhal, India Economist at Quantico Research, also with us. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for speaking with us on this budget special on Mirror Now, where we're hoping to focus on the issues that matter to the common men and women of India. Madan, let me begin with your take on the topic we've picked and how crucial it is from the budget point of view, because there is no one tool or one lever specifically that any finance minister can use. But there are a host of steps that can be taken to mitigate or minimize the impact of inflation, isn't it? Let's begin with that. What can she do?
So I would tend to think that since GST is largely outside the purview of the budget, since any decision out there is going to be taken outside by the GST Council, we cannot really rely on anything being done on the indirect tax front. But what really can be done is to do something on the personal income tax. I think the slabs have remained unchanged for over a decade. And I think it's necessary to revisit them and make sure they're calibrated along with inflation so that we're able to protect the real income of all salary payers. I think that could be probably the only thing which could be done in the budget, which could be providing some kind of protection from the point of view of consumption. I really don't think this can be very large in terms of helping to propel the economy, but it'll be more a case of correcting something which is amiss as far as consumers are concerned. And since we know very well that consumption is going to peter off in the next financial year, because whatever pent-up demand was there for both consumption of goods and services has probably plateaued and may probably come down, there will definitely be some advantage, both from the point of view of individuals as well as the government in terms of possible tax collection on the GST on this additional income which could possibly be spent. Of course, there's no guarantee everything that is saved is going to be spent. We've also seen savings taking a hit in the current financial year. There would be some kind of distribution between consumption and savings.
The other aspect, and Mr. Subhash Chandra Garg, it'll be very interesting to know the kind of process that goes into budget making and whether inflation is a focus. Forget about minimizing inflation. The concern seriously is that if once again import duties or custom duties are increased on a host of items, it will increase the expense of these items. They might not be in the category of essential like food you eat, but it will definitely increase the cost of those who consume them, isn't it? Is the question of inflation there in the back of the mind when the budget is being formed at all?
See, macroeconomic stability is the biggest public good, and that is the government's responsibility. And budget is a big tool to sort of affect and the effect, bring the right kind of effects in the inflation dynamics in the context of macroeconomic stability. So I would always believe that the government has enormous role to play in the inflation management of the country. In India, especially, the government has presence in not only managing the macroeconomic stability as such as a policy and taking counter-cyclical as well as the ameliorative measures, but also a participant in the inflation dynamics. Government produces lots of goods and services through their public sector enterprises, government enterprises, let us say transportations in the state, the buses, also the steels and many other kind of things. So, and then you distribute food, big programs are taken. So there is a very large role which the government has played. To play. Now, to come to your question about the import related kind of thing and tariffs. So that also is one of the important facet, because if you raise the import duties, there would be an impact on the inflation. It's more pronounced if the import prices on their own are rising even otherwise. For example, when the crude went to 110, 120 or more, the impact on the fuel prices would be much more if you raise the tariffs. Likewise, if you are in a shorter supply situation, for example, wheat or rice for that matter, and you allow the export as well as put more export, less export duties on that, the chances of inflation getting worsening is there. So there is a big role there. Now, whether the government will increase duties on some of the items which in the budget, that is not related to my mind to the inflation management. It's more towards the protection of the economy.
That's true, sir. But it does fuel into. I'm looking at it from the point of view of our viewers right now, who are dealing with inflation. And when we break down on budget day, before budget day, what all of these announcements actually mean to us. So, for example, if the finance minister last year increases duties on imported umbrellas, the decision is perhaps to encourage the manufacture of umbrellas in India.
Yeah, that's correct. So there is no price impact.
But for the person who has been buying umbrellas of a certain quality and want a specific kind of easily available umbrella, I'm just taking this as an example because this actually happened last year, the price of that umbrella is going to go up, which is adding to the burden of a pocket.
See, theoretically, yes. But then we need to remember that umbrellas constitute very small amount of consumption. It doesn't matter too much if you do it for the food. For example, if you raise the export duties on wheat to discourage the consumption, that's much more likely to affect. Or if you put more duties on the import of oil or these kind of products, then that is a much direct impact on the consumers, unlike the umbrella. So the umbrella was purely for encouraging this misguided policy of encouraging domestic production.
No, so I took the example of umbrellas. I'm going to get Rajni Sinha into this conversation. This happens on a host of items, right? Your imported screens, which you use for your mobile phones, LED screens, electronic equipment. A lot of this stuff is imported into India, though PLI has pushed at least the final product manufacturing in terms of numbers. A lot of the components are still imported. You add duties or you increase duties in that, your smartphone that you're going to buy or any electronic equipment you're going to buy does become more expensive. So there is a link on what happens in the budget and how much more you're going to spend, isn't it, Ms. Sinha?
Yeah, definitely, Tamanna. There would be some impact of that. But firstly, I would like to highlight that I feel in this budget, the focus of the government would be on how to move towards fiscal consolidation and at the same time ensure inclusive growth. So because it's a challenging task in itself, because we are all aware we are expecting nominal GDP growth to slow down. And in such a situation, even while ensuring growth, how will government be able to reduce the fiscal deficit? That's going to be the focus of the government. As far as inflation is concerned, I think a lot of steps, if you see during the year, government did take in FY23 as required, in terms of cutting import duty on some items, excise duty on some items, export ban or export duty. So as required, a lot of steps were taken during the year. And I feel that going forward, if it is required, government will do it during the year and not necessarily in the budget, because I feel that inflation slowly is going to moderate. Because, if we are talking about global slowdown, global commodity prices are going to go down, have been moderating. Even though, a lot of pent-up demand that we saw in the domestic economy, that is also going to slow down a little bit next year. So in that sense, the pressure on inflation will reduce. But having said that, core inflation is very sticky, and it has been found to be always very difficult to reverse core inflation. Hence, to that extent, the government would be conscious of that and see to it that they do not announce anything that is further inflationary for the economy. So I think that's the kind of focus government will have on inflation.
Right. You know, the other
I
part
don't
of
think
it,
anything
the
significant.
other part of it also is how do you push consumption, very crucial for, a consumer-led economy like ours. Rajni Sinha, the point being made about tax, direct tax incentives, which Madan Sabnavis spoke about it, completely crucial right now. There's a lot of buzz that the new tax regime will be tweaked a bit and maybe some, deductions added to it, maybe the rates sweetened. One doesn't really know what the formula is. But do you think that that's very important right now?
So, Tamanna, the interesting thing is that the government did not do it even after the pandemic. So, even after the pandemic year, when we were coming out of the crisis, government did not use such direct means to perk up the economy.
Right.
The government had, in fact, used the strategy of using a lot of indirect means of pushing up investment in the economy, capex in the economy, and indirectly supporting consumption. So, I think, given the fiscal limitations that the government will have this year, I think they will stick to that route. But having said that, yes, I completely agree with you that India is a consumption led economy. And especially now, what we are seeing is that we've seen in the last 2 years that the lower strata of the economy has been impacted more by this pandemic and more by the inflation that we have had in the last 1 year. And hence, it would be good if they get some kind of support from this budget.
All right. Yuvika Singhal, your take on the inflation issue and how and whether it should feature as a broader question in the budget. What would you expect from this perspective?
Tamanna, honestly speaking, inflation is one subject which touches the lives of every person in the economy. Every stakeholder, it's something which pinches from the poorest of the poor and the richest of the rich. And not finding a mention or, not finding it in the thought process of the government when they are constructing the budget is very hard to imagine. So yes, at the back of the mind, the government has inflation, the levels of inflation, how has it been hitting the masses, definitely when it's constructing the budget. Now, how can we assuage the impact of inflation while obviously there is scope for the government to dole out measures outside the budget? But since we are focused on the budget, I think one key measure that the government can take is to reduce the excise duty on fuel products. If we compare the current level of excise duties, they still remain somewhat higher than the levels that we have seen in the pre-pandemic level. And any kind of reduction or reprieve on fuel prices has a mass impact on everybody. And not to forget, it's not just inflation assuaging in its direct impact, but it also has second-order impact since it tends to lower the cost of transportation and logistics. Also, you spoke about the new tax regime that the government had introduced. Now, I'm no tax expert, but we also know from various sources that this new tax regime hasn't really taken off. Now, it's time that the government, instead of wanting to look at exemptions and they want to steer away from the older regime to a newer regime, and they need to sweeten that regime so that what essentially happens as a consumer, I get a better deal such that my taxable income is reduced in a manner that is indirectly, again, a hedge against inflation. So I think these two factors will probably somewhere weigh more materially on the government, and more so the new tax regime, how to make it so sweet a deal that the consumers actually opt for it, and that also plays as a role to hedge against inflation.
The other question, of course, taxation will have to be tweaked to give any kind of real benefit to the average Indian. I also want to get your sense on the PLI scheme. Yuvika Singhal, again, this question for you, because the PLI scheme has been much touted as our answer, our reprieve to what to do for the economy after the pandemic. While other economies gave out quote-unquote doles, they gave money, literally money to people to spend, we said we're going to set up this PLI scheme, play the long game, encourage manufacturing, will improve jobs, will make things in India which will be cheaper. Do you see the government or this budget doubling down on that?
Absolutely, Tamanna. I think from when we talk about the PLI scheme and we put it in the context of inflation, no doubt it's not a sprint, but it's probably a slow run marathon for the Indian economy. But we have tasted success in some of the sectors like mobile phone productions or electronic items, where we do see not just higher production but also higher exports from the country. And what it essentially means is that when we are augmenting the productive capacity of the economy, when we are creating more assets, when we are augmenting the supply side, always remember that inflation is nothing but a balance of demand and supply. And any time we push outward the aggregate supply curve, that is when we are augmenting the supply in the economy, there's bound to be a downward pressure on prices. And that's essentially the economic theory behind PLI. And like I said, we have tested success in some of the sectors. It's still in nascent stage. And not to forget that the pandemic did derail the plans of the PLIs for several companies by at least a year and a half. So we got to be patient in this game. And in fact, we do believe that there is scope to enhance the scope of PLI beyond the 13, 14 sunrise sectors that the government has already been working on and announced. Some of the items of mass consumption, say for example, those related to leather or cosmetics or some of the key FMCG products, some of these items, textiles for that matter, could see a much more vigorous inclusion within the PLI scheme in probably in the budget or soon thereafter, because these sectors are the ones which create large-scale employment. They have the capacity to cater to our local domestic consumption demand and as well as cater to the global markets. So augmenting supplies through the PLI as well as enhancement of the scope of PLI does remain something which is of absolute essential or a necessity for the economy.
You know, Madan Sabnavis, just on the point of excise duty on fuel, there's already been some cuts. Is there scope for more? Fiscally, is there scope for more?
No, definitely there is scope for cutting the excise duty, but I don't think it will happen. And if at all it's going to happen, it will probably happen towards the end of the fiscal year, just before the elections. That's the time when you really make an impact, when you reduce the excise duty. And as of today, we're not even quite sure as to how the crude oil price will behave. There's times when the Brent comes below 80. There's certain other points of time when we go to 85, 86. So I think we need to see how the China factor works out. And in case there's an upheaval in China in the positive direction, we could again see commodity prices going up. So I'm quite sure the government will wait and watch and will have an intervention as and when it's required. Now, this said, I think, Tamanna, I would also like to comment a little bit on the PLI scheme. I think while PLI is very good, maybe it should be introduced for SMEs, but I think we're going back to the days of the 70s where we were subsidizing industry, we were protecting industry. So I don't think ideologically it's something which should be persevered with, because we can't have industries growing on the back of money being given by the government. You should be able to stand on your own. We're talking of free markets all the time. We're talking of less government intervention. So today it's an ironic situation where SM industries are saying that, look, we want government support. Electronics doing well. Look, our import bill is also increasing. So I don't know how much the PLI has actually contributed. Exports have gone up, but our imports have also gone up.
Exactly. SC Garg, you know, your comment on excise duty on fuel, the scope for that, because that will make an immediate impact. And yes, they're going into the budget. The government gets to go into the budget with a sub 6% CPI number, which will give some comfort. It looks good, but it does not mean that people aren't feeling the pinch. So do you think that there is less incentive now to make those kind of cuts like excise duty and the long-term impact of PLI?
See, I think the excise debate is past its prime time, to my mind. The global prices have come down substantially. The inflation is behaving much more in the light of global recession, etc. I think Chinese demand is a little bit more hyped and more kind of scare than real, to my mind. The Chinese now entering into a space where they are actually declining in terms of population. So I don't think anything happening on the excise front. If you could weather this during the time when there was so much of inflation, both on the wholesale side as well as on the retail side. Now, when this is becoming more of a, in fact, wholesale side, you might see dipping into the negative very soon. So on excise, my understanding and assessment is very clear that nothing is likely to be done on lowering the rate. It's not going to make much difference. PLI, I think what Madan was saying, we should listen very carefully. PLI's basic design is to compensate for extra cost of doing business in the country. There is larger power costs, there is higher interest costs, land, many other things, and we are not competitive globally in producing many of these goods and services in comparison to the global take electronics for that matter, or textile for that matter. The textile is moving away from China, but it's not coming to India. India is actually declining.
Bangladesh have sort of stolen a march.
Bangladesh is doing on electronics. Vietnam produce 13 to 15 times more electronics today than we do it. These are very small gains. Very assembling mobile phones, etc., is a very, very low value add kind of thing. We don't have any real technologies on semiconductors or chips or solar or those kind of things. So PLI is a sort of attempt to try to compensate our general level of non-competitiveness. And this is exactly doing what Madan was saying, that we are, the government is entering into industries of all types today and making industries is a kind of subordinate to the government, which is not what the maximum governance and minimum government should be. So PLI was good for only 1 or 2 or 3 critical items where we can bring the global production here. For example, mobile, I had a lot of sympathies because there are only 4 or 5 global producers. And if you can get them here, then that might be working. But as a general, if you extend it to everyone, air conditioners, textile, SMEs, etc., it's only going to be a waste, and it's going to expand the state's footprint everywhere in the industry. So I think we should be careful
yes, PLI is not necessarily the panacea of all our problems on the manufacturing side.
Panacea, it's going to be